So one of the upshots of the Jungian theory is that to the degree you don't bear the responsibility for your own actions, to the degree that you avoid responsibility or shunt them off onto, say, totalitarian or ideological systems, so when you avoid responsibility for your own thought, because if you're the follower of an ideological system, you have avoided the responsibility of thinking for yourself. And the consequence of that was continual catastrophe as those pathological rational systems unfolded themselves. Solzhenitsyn wrote the Gulag Archipelago, published it in the early 1970s, and there were two things that made that book very striking. One was the stories that he told were so unbelievably powerful that you couldn't read them and not believe it was true. And that was even the case if you were a devoted Marxist. And at that time, in the universities, and in many ways it hasn't changed that much, the universities in the West were dominated by Marxists. And to some degree that was ethically inexcusable, because people had known since the 1950s, especially since George Orwell wrote, people had known since the 1950s that the Stalinist state was murderous beyond belief. So Stalin, for example, killed 6 million Ukrainians in the 1930s. He starved them to death, because all of the farmers had been collectivized at that point. And what that meant was all the good farmers had been killed, and all the resentful farmers had been given the land, and then they collectivized the farms, and then Stalin took all the food to feed the cities, or to starve the Ukrainians, depending on how you look at it. And the edicts were so harsh that if you were Ukrainian, and you had a family, and they were starving, and you went into a field after it had been harvested, and you picked out individual grains from the dirt to gather in a bowl to feed your family, if you got caught, then they would shoot you. Solzhenitsyn observed this, and he was very interested in how this system developed. And his conclusion, after decades of thinking, was that the reason the Russian system was able to maintain itself fundamentally was because individuals were willing to give up the responsibility of their own relationship to the truth, to the state, and constantly lie to themselves about everything. And that if the individuals that composed the state had refused to accept things that they knew full well to be untrue, that the state wouldn't have been able to survive. And, you know, Solzhenitsyn's case is very strong, because in some sense he was the first person who told the truth about the Gulag Archipelago, which was this chain of prison camps that the Soviets had erected, on which their economy was essentially based. He was the first person who really told the truth about that. And he hit the foundations of Marxist theory so hard that, well, partly it collapsed and partly it went underground into movements like postmodernism. So his proposition, it's a Dostoevskian proposition actually, that one person who stopped lying could overturn a tyranny. It's a hard thing to believe, but there's been multiple examples of that sort of thing in the 20th century. It happened with Gandhi, it happened with Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, it happened with Nelson Mandela, it happened with Solzhenitsyn. You know, so those are pretty powerful examples of the power of a single individual who refuses to accept the conventional lie. Dostoevsky was writing about the same time as Nietzsche, and Dostoevsky is a very interesting person. He was an Orthodox Christian, although he's a very intelligent man. And Dostoevsky and Nietzsche are twins in some sense. So what Nietzsche wrote in philosophy, Dostoevsky wrote in literature. And one of Dostoevsky's primary statements was that if there's no God, everything is permitted. So it's a take on Nietzsche's discussion of nihilism. It's like, well, if there's no ultimate value of any sort, then why can't you do exactly what you want? And that's a theme he explores to great purpose in Crime and Punishment. Dostoevsky's conclusion was that the reason you can't do anything you want is because you actually come equipped with an inherent set of values that are real, and that if you violate them to too great a degree, you'll destroy your own structure, as well as damaging the society that's around you. So Dostoevsky was a big believer, in some sense like the Jungians and the Rogerians, that there are the locus of values within a human being, and that it's an actual thing. You can't disregard it without damage. Dostoevsky was also a very powerful critic of reason, and the reason for that was, it was reason in some sense that brought down the house of cards, so to speak, that constituted classical faiths. But the consequence of that rational destruction of values was the emergence of nihilism or totalitarianism. And the consequence of those two things is either the inability to live or the emergence of the murderous state. So Dostoevsky looked at that and thought, okay, well, perhaps our belief that reason itself is the proper guide to reality is wrong. And so this is one of the things he wrote in Notes from Underground when he was exploring this idea. Notes from Underground, by the way, it's a very short book, and it's very much worth reading. Dostoevsky wrote 5 books that are incalculably great. And what happened to Dostoevsky, I don't remember if I told you this or not, but he was a student radical, and he was arrested by the Tsar's men because of a riot or a protest that him and his compatriots had come up with. He was sort of a bit player in it, but they put him in prison when he was a young man. And then he was in prison for quite a while, and then one day they took him out into the courtyard and they shot him at dawn. You know, they had the soldiers line up and put him by a post and shot him. But they used blanks. But he didn't know that. And it scared him so bad he had epileptic seizure. And then he had epileptic seizures for the rest of his life. And the kind of epileptic seizures he had were associated with mystical experience. So Dostoevsky, before he got a seizure, would have this sense that he was experiencing the world in a more and more meaningful way until he was on the very dawn of sort of omniscient knowledge, and then he'd have a seizure. But it wasn't until he was shot with blanks and then put in this terrible prison for a long period of time and had epilepsy that he became a great novelist. It changed him in some way. His early writings are really, they're not good. They're sterile and dry. And his later writings, the 5 great novels in particular, they're in a class of their own. So Dostoevsky, the first thing Dostoevsky tried to come to grips with was the fact he didn't believe that life itself was rational. Because that's an Enlightenment proposition, that the structure of reality is in and of itself rational, so it can be dealt with by rational means. And that's been a very powerful theory because it's enabled us to develop this scientific viewpoint and the technology that goes along with it. But rationality is not the only mode of human knowing. There's all sorts of other modes of human knowing, and many of those are associated with emotion and motivation. They're more biologically instantiated, say, and less computational. And rationality has a very difficult time even conceptualizing how those other modes of knowing might be real, and so what it tends to do is denigrate them as mere opponents to rationality. But the Dostoevskian perspective, and this is also something that Rogers followed up on, and Jung, was that life itself is so irrational, or experience itself is so irrational, given its suffering and its absurdity, that a merely rationally formulated representation of life is insufficient. It can't manage the job. And what rationality will therefore do is cut away everything from life, cut away everything from its definition of reality that it can't actually encapsulate.